As an avid user of VR, I was extremely excited when it was revealed that Valve is creating their own standalone headset. Yes, this is not just the Index, this is not the Vive. The new Steam frame is here to introduce PC gamers to the world of standalone VR, much like the Meta Quest series, and I'm excited about this.
The Black Friday discount season is upon us, with MSI bringing some of its biggest savings ever. Get up to 45% off MSI displays, including their critically acclaimed QD OLEDs like the MPG 272URX and the MPG 321URXW, and get a free Borderlands game code when you buy from selected partners. And there's more. Grab up to £100 in Steam codes with select RTX 50 series graphics cards and up to £70 off MSI motherboards, cases and coolers while stocks last. Click the link in the video description below for more details.
But unfortunately, this was revealed all the way out in Seattle, which just happens to be close to my good friend and colleague, Oliver McKenzie.
Yeah, it's just a short 3 or 4 hour train ride later. And I was at Valve headquarters in Bellevue, Washington, right next to Seattle. And yeah, I did have the opportunity to see the Steam frame as well as 2 other devices, the Steam Machine and Steam Controller, both of which I think we featured in a video that should be published a few hours before this one if everything goes to plan. But yeah, I had a lot of fun taking a look at Valve's new headset.
Yes, and it's a beautiful looking headset with a very unconventional design. More of a focus on balancing the weight, it seems, between the front and the back, with the battery mounted to the back of the headset and the sort of visor complete with a removable section the front, which is really interesting. So before we even get into the specs, tell me, how comfortable was this?
It was pretty comfortable. Like you said, I think the key innovation here is they've mounted the battery on the back side of the headset. So that helps to split the weight. Now, if you look at a product like the Apple Vision Pro, right? The first generation of that product had all the weight in the front, but for the second generation, they actually added a counterweight to the back. So this is like a natural counterweight that actually enhances the device's functionality, leaves you with a much less front heavy device, and allows the weight to be distributed equally. It also has like a ski mask style band that's horizontal that helps to distribute the weight very evenly. I found the mask itself to be very, very comfortable. It has this nice cloth interior. It feels very good over the head. I don't think it will fit glasses necessarily, but with contacts it was fine. So that's one note. But presumably maybe you'll be able to get inserts for it from a third party or something down the line. I found it very, very comfortable, I'd have to say. It's a very comfortable feeling headset.
Oh, that's cool. Actually, speaking of inserts, that's something I buy for all my headsets now because I think it really makes the experience better. Did you happen to note any sort of like potentially easy mounting points for those? Because per headset, it's quite variable.
No, I didn't notice anything like that particularly. I will say that the headset does sit quite close to your face, and it is relatively thin, right? I don't know, maybe we're skipping ahead a bit, but it uses pancake lenses, so it does sit quite close to your face. But I presume if you had thin inserts, like Index 1.67 inserts or something, that would probably work. I imagine, but again, I have no particular knowledge of that.
I guess we'll have to wait and see on that. I know on the Quest 3, they click in very nicely with very thin little inserts versus like say the PSVR 2 where they're very clunky, but hopefully that is taken care of. We'll actually talk more about the optics and the screens in a moment, but let's talk about the basics of the hardware then, right? Like this is a standalone unit. So obviously it's designed to function by itself, just like the Quest 3. Presumably it runs their sort of like Steam VR form of like a Steam OS style environment, which is something else we'll get to. But first, what's the hardware in this thing?
Yeah, so it is a standalone headset, but I would contrast this a little bit against devices like the Quest, where the Quest is really a fully on its own, fully self-contained, well outside of the controllers, of course, headset, right? It's designed to be used with the internal processor. It has an app store. It has all these things. The Steam frame is much more of like a the emphasis is more on streaming, but it also has these standalone gaming capabilities, right? So I'd contrast that a little bit, where it is a standalone headset,
Mm.
but it's not quite, it's more in the middle of kind of a streaming headset and a standalone headset, where something like the Meta Quest can do streaming, but it's more emphasized on the standalone portion of that. In terms of spec, the internals are interesting here. We're looking at a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 processor and
Mhm.
16 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM. So that's a pretty powerful phone processor. That's the kind of chip that would have been seen in 2023, 2024 cell phones, right? That's a pretty powerful chip. And it also has the benefit here of actually being actively cooled. So it has a small heatsink, small fan, and it also has multiple TDP modes that you can use here. So you
Ah,
have like a high
nice.
performance, performance, balanced, whatever, power saving, that kind of thing. It has a 21.6 watt hour battery, which again is mounted to the back there. And battery life is a bit up in the air, but a Valve engineer told me like best case, about 4 hours. Worst case, maybe 1 hour, right? Depending on what you're doing.
Mm,
So streaming, you'd think would be closer to that 4 hour mark. If you're running
sure.
like an intense game in the turbo mode or whatever it happens to be, that would probably be a little bit closer to that 1 hour mark, because that chip itself, you're probably pulling 15 watts off the chip, 12 watts off the chip. You're pulling a considerable amount of power for those displays and every other component that goes into this headset. So that's basically the internal spec in terms of performance. But obviously, it comes with some storage, so it has either a 256 gigabyte configuration or a 1 terabyte storage configuration, and it has a micro SD slot. Now, this
Ah,
SD
okay.
slot, it's not SD
Mhm.
Express, so it's not necessarily the fastest. Although I think for the
Mm.
kinds of games you'd be running on this device, probably not too much of an issue, I would think. And interestingly, critically, you can take an SD card from your Steam Deck or from your Steam machine and load it into this headset, hot swap it into this headset, and actually
No
play
way.
games that way. Yeah, it's really cool. So you can have a game library, like a 1 terabyte SD card. You just move it between units. So you don't actually have to re-download that software.
All of that is pretty good, and it definitely sounds like a nice sort of upgrade over what we have on the Quest 3. Specifically, it has double the amount of memory for starters, which is huge. But then the other thing is just having swappable storage at all. The Quest 3 does not have this currently, so you buy in with either the 128 gigabyte or the 512 gigabyte model, and you're stuck with it, right? So there's no way to expand it. Um, and there's some other functionality on the Steam Deck, or sorry, on the Steam Frame. I'm already thinking this Valve lineup that would make expandable storage, I guess, more valuable perhaps than it even is on the Quest. But um, so yeah, that's really interesting stuff, I think.
So, John, I know you had some thoughts on the display as well, now that we're getting to that section of things. I think the display is maybe one of the more interesting aspects of this device's hardware, but I know you're a big, a big fan of these low persistence displays. So what do you have to say on that, John?
Yes, Oliver, that is indeed the case. So for VR, I've come to discover that the single most important thing is display persistence. Uh, Followed by, well, it's display persistence, then optics, and then the contrast performance of the screen itself. So first of all, according to the spec sheet, then we're looking at 2160 by 2160 per eye, making it in the ballpark of the Quest 3, which isn't a perfect square, unlike this. But
Hmm.
the key here that I'm seeing, and this is exciting, is that it does, as you mentioned earlier, use pancake lenses, which for those that haven't experienced them versus the more classic Fresnel lenses that had been featured in most headsets up to this point, the difference in clarity is dramatic. It was I always, in my head, I didn't expect it to be this big, but when I got the Quest 3, I really realized just how much of a difference it genuinely makes, specifically in terms of overall edge-to-edge clarity. It
Hmm.
just feels like the view you get is wider and easier to see, and it's just sharp everywhere. When you go back to older Fresnel style lenses, like you get so much like fringing and just issues on the outer area of the lenses, which I really do think detracts from the experience. So I'm happy that they've embraced that as well. And then there's the refresh rate. And this is something there's the refresh rate and the contrast. You're going to have to tell me what your impressions are on this, Oliver.
Hmm.
First of all, what makes the Quest 3 so good for me is the fact that it's able to do like essentially perfect motion clarity. They specifically drive the LCD, the low persistence LCD in exactly the right way that allows it to update with no motion blur. The reason you don't really see this on desktop monitors so much is because it would have a gigantic impact on brightness. And in fact, that's why we typically don't see OLED displays in these headsets with this level of low persistence, it turns out, because OLEDs can't get bright enough to actually do it at this rate, unfortunately. So LCD, that's, they're able to leverage that brightness to get a very low persistence, basically no visible motion blur or sample and hold blur, right? And when the screen is all around you, this makes a gigantic difference. And this is something the Quest 3 does. So that's important. But at the same time, what you give up on the Quest 3, and it's pretty bad, I have to say, the contrast ratio is horrendously bad. Basically, you just get like a face full of backlight, and there's really no way to compensate for it. Even using the auto brightness and other features like that, it doesn't work great. And so you basically just kind of accept that the contrast performance is poor. Now, Steam Frame, you're telling me that they also went with LCD and are targeting this low persistence. So one, I'm curious about your impressions on this, but two, has there been any movement improvements in terms of the contrast ratio?
So I would say that overall, my impressions as someone who, I own a Quest 3, I own a PSVR 2, I also have a Quest 2. My impressions of the display are that it's pretty similar to that Quest 3 display in all the elements that you specified. So that has some very positive elements, like in terms of the motion persistence, in terms of limiting that sample and hold blur, everything in that display. It feels like a very low persistence, very crisp display. Now, I'm not as finely attuned to this as John is. Famously, I don't mind blurrier LCD televisions, right, which have their own issues with motion persistence. But certainly I think it's a good display from that perspective. I did not notice anything egregious out of the ordinary. They said they're strobing the display at 300 microseconds to achieve. So that's pretty intense. They did report to me that this is basically similar to the Valve Index as well, but the Valve Index was pretty widely reputed as having a very low persistence display. And obviously, because of the pancake optics and because of that strobing behavior, they need to have extremely high brightness on the panel level. But when it gets to your eye, the perceived brightness of that display is more like 100 nits, is what they said. Yep. So think about it in context, right? If you're in a really bright outdoor sunny day and you're looking at your iPhone or something, you probably need 1,000, 1,500 nits, right? But if you're in a completely enclosed dark space like a movie theater, 100 nits could be appropriate. Or even in movie theaters, sometimes it's as low as like 50 nits, right? So in context, exactly. I think it looks fine. I think it looks pretty good. But it does have some consequences when it comes to black levels, contrast. Obviously, you aren't getting an HDR presentation out of that because it's a uniformly lit panel, right? And it's relatively low brightness. So those are some significant compromises. And you can definitely notice, like the moment that I put on the headset, I realized it was an LCD because I'm looking at a black background and it's gray. It's supposed to be black, but it's gray.
So it's the same problem then.
Yeah,
But I get it.
Yeah. And also, it's worth pointing out, too, that the panel has a fixed refresh rate and it goes between 72 hertz all the way to double that at 144 hertz. Ooh. But the 144 hertz mode is labeled as experimental. I don't know exactly what that means. It could just be a battery life thing, right? But it goes all the way to 120. 120 hertz is like the maximum, not labeled as experimental refresh rate. So that's I would say a pretty good refresh rate for this kind of headset. Should eliminate most of the kind of discomfort that I think people have with VR systems. I think it should feel pretty good.
Okay. Well, so while it doesn't address my key complaint with the contrast, I'd still say it sounds pretty good, given that the Quest 3 screen, I think, is also excellent right now. It's still the best way to view VR. Outside of some of the really high-end PC headsets, of course, which are extremely heavy, like the Pimax stuff, that does technically look better, but they're huge and not really usable in the same way. So for a small headset, these pancake lenses, I think they're pretty awesome, and the motion clarity is supreme. And yeah, unfortunately, when you're strobing the screen 300 microseconds per frame, that also rules out things like individual backlight elements, right? You can't do zones. You can't like adjust the contrast in any meaningful way. It would just be too impossibly slow.
Yeah.
And that's essentially the problem they're solving, which is why we need a self-lit panel that can get bright enough for this to really work. And unfortunately, OLED just isn't yet there. Even though it has a very low pixel response time, there's still sample and hole blur to contend with. So it requires it would require essentially black frame insertion rather than strobing,
Right.
because it does not have a backlight to strobe. But still, okay, so that's interesting then. The other thing about it that caught my attention, though, and this kind of, I guess, speaks to what it is versus the Quest 3. The Quest 3 is very much an AR-focused headset. The Steam frame does not seem to be, and as such, it seems to have monochrome cameras on the outside. So when doing pass-through, I assume it's mainly for just setting up the room, similar to any modern headset with cameras. And I guess maybe switching out if you just need to check on something in the real world, but it's not really designed for AR. And that's consistent with their messaging, I believe.
Yeah, this is strictly a VR headset. It does have the ability to pass through some video, obviously,
Sure,
with these monochromatic sensors. But first of all, they're monochromatic, as we've stated.
yeah.
Second of all, they're very
That's
low
fine.
resolution and noisy. But the upside of these monochromatic sensors is presumably they can let more light in, right? They can
True.
actually work in near total darkness. So with a device like the Quest, you need to actually have that room illuminated to some degree. You should be able to have a near complete darkness. I think they also have some IR illuminators, things like this, so that really helps them with the low light tracking capabilities. It also has, obviously, cameras inside the headset for foveated rendering purposes, looking at your eyes.
That was going to be the next thing I mentioned. This is something that the PSVR 2 also does with actual eye tracking, but the Quest does not.
Right.
And I found that it's interesting in terms if developers can use it for gameplay purposes, but I suspect that won't really be the case here much because this is a Steam VR product. But the automatic foveated rendering using eye tracking, I know that works well based on the PSVR 2 experience. So I'm very excited to see it here. And I believe you tested this, Oliver. And
I did.
Did you find like with the PSVR where it feels like it updates so quickly that you can't really perceive a change in the surrounding resolution?
Yeah, so they actually had a few demos for me. Few demos for me where they showed off both the foveated rendering functionality as well as foveated streaming, which is a new technology they have. So basically the idea is the place you're looking in, they're going to dynamically give it more bitrate and dynamically decrease the bitrate in areas of the headset that you're not looking. So this is a part of their complement of streaming technologies. It also complements the fact they actually have a dedicated streaming stick, a wireless adapter for top quality streaming. And it really makes this like a very distinctly streaming focused headset that has these technologies that actually allow it to work better as a streaming headset. And like you mentioned, foveated rendering, that's just kind of like one of those great tricks. But on a headset like this, especially with relatively low power, at least in its standalone mode, that could be really helpful for rendering various VR games, right?
Oh, that's a huge deal, actually.
Yeah.
I really want to see if they can leverage this in standalone games, right? Because these headsets are very resolution sensitive, as we've seen on the Quest, and why a lot of games have to dial down their settings on the Quest 3 even. And if you can rely more on foveated rendering to sort of like divide it up so that where your eye is focusing is sharper than the rest of the screen, you can still have a better overall image without like breaking the bank in terms of rendering performance or draining the battery. Because you mentioned like the high performance mode on there. You can technically do that with the Quest 3 you can load with side quests. There's like the Quest 3 unlocker. I forget what it's called. But you can essentially overclock it in any game, and that absolutely decimates the battery. And makes the headset run very hot. So I'm happy that at least the Valve headset seems to support this out of the gate. So it's an official thing to allow you to run it at full clocks, which is cool. And it seems like that should work pretty well, especially with the foveated rendering. So there's all of that stuff. The last bits, there's a couple other things on the hardware side that I'm curious about. First of all, that module bit, the how you can disconnect the part of the headset. What was the purpose of this? Because the way I first heard about it made it sound like, oh, it's actually like a second computer thing, but you're saying it's actually like a little bit different than that. Like, explain what this is about.
Essentially, with this device, there's like two components to it, right? At least as it's shipping at the moment.
Right.
There's the headset module, which is like the glasses, the back half of the glasses that attach to your face, the padding, the straps. Then there's the band with a wire in it going to the battery, right? But then there's this
Mm-hmm.
front module, I think they called it a compute module, which is basically the display, the tracking hardware, the SoC, the fan, the motherboard, all in one module that attaches magnetically to this headset band. So I think the idea is that in the future, right, you could have different capabilities built into different headset bands, right? As an addition to this
Oh.
device. So at the moment, that functionality at least is not forthcoming necessarily in anything they're shipping, but it could come from third parties or could come from Valve itself in the future. You could have different kinds of bands if that's something you're interested in. It also has a little port in the front, so you could connect
Interesting.
they said maybe you could put a little SSD in there or something in the future. I'm not sure how much utility that would have, but it certainly is interesting.
Okay, and then obviously we got to talk about the controllers.
Yeah.
So at last, I think it's kind of largely been decided that where I guess Oculus went with their motion controllers back with the original Oculus Rift, and so on, and now with the Meta Quest, like that form factor is essentially, in my opinion anyway, the best form factor.
Hmm.
Right? Like we've seen a lot of different attempts. There was the Vive wands at first, and then Valve did the Knuckles or whatever, which was with the finger tracking and all that. And it's interesting, but it's a bit large and clunky. With the Quest 3, Meta was able to shrink it down to just these like single little small controllers without any rings or anything wild on it. It's just
Hmm.
very compact, very comfortable to use. From what I'm seeing here, Valve has essentially done exactly that, but then they've sort of introduced a full set of buttons, which is actually going to be very important for some other functions.
Yeah. So the key development here, like you said, they're very similar to Quest 3 controllers. So if you go back to the Quest 2 or PSVR 2, they have these big tracking rings built into them, right?
Yep.
The Quest 3 eliminated those tracking rings. It's the same story here. Instead, they're using a ring of LEDs around the edge that shine through slightly through this transparent plastic. They're using some inside-out tracking with the headset to track those controllers in 3D space, and that felt very good to me. That felt like a very reliable tracking experience. But like you said, the kind of key innovation here, so-called, I mean, it's the key development with this device and its controllers. It has a full 8-button layout plus D-pad plus 2 analog clickable analog sticks plus these palm buttons as well. So that gives you functionality that allows you to play conventional so-called 2D flat screen games on the device,
Right.
which is a critical functionality this device has. Obviously, other headsets can do the same, but in order to play those games in a fulsome manner, you might need to swap out your controller, right? In this case, you can continue to use those controllers and enjoy your 2D flat screen games on the device.
So that's actually interesting because one of my favorite VR experiences still was the new retro arcade Neon, where you essentially build out a virtual arcade and you wander around it in 3D and you can walk up and play the machines. But the problem there was always exactly this: you didn't have enough buttons on the Quest controllers to do it. And now with these new Steam controllers, that sort of thing would be possible. In addition, of course, to original games and 2D games and all that kind of stuff. But I think that stuff is cool. So, I mean, overall, then the hardware is very interesting. I'm very curious to wear it. It seems comfortable, perhaps more so than many other headsets on the market, just in terms of the weight distribution. And it's a smaller, lighter design. Because obviously, the big thing was always the larger the front, the more it sort of weighs down on your forehead and temples and everything. And that's not great. So, this seems like it's a step in the right direction. I cannot wait to test that. Oh yeah, I guess one last question about the hardware before we move on to the more performance-based and discussion and the experience. What about the audio? Yeah, because like it looks like it's again adopted a Quest 3 like design where they've essentially embedded audio somewhere into the headset in a way that it sort of projects sound to your ears rather than like wearing full-on headphones.
So basically, in the device, there are 2 speaker drivers, or I think it's on the headband itself, basically, feeding
Okay.
audio into your ears. And they sounded pretty good to me. It's kind of a similar setup, I think, to other devices like the Quest, where it's like it's not as good as actually plugging in a headset yourself, actually
Sure,
plugging in
sure.
headphones yourself. That's probably better. But even in a fairly loud, somewhat noisy demo room, I was able to hear that sound pretty precisely, and it sounded pretty good to me, right? It sounded pretty good to me.
So yeah, hardware overall, great stuff. But now let's talk about the two functions. There's essentially two things you can do with this. Well, almost three in a way. There's native VR games running on the headset. There's streaming, where you're using your PC to power the games and streaming to the headset. And then there's native, or maybe not native, but running Steam games, 2D Steam games natively on the headset in a way in that you're actually using a standalone unit, which is a very unique feature that nothing else currently really does. So, but let's go ahead and start with native gaming. So it does seem to use Steam OS for starters. And actually, did you get a chance to experience the OS at all?
Not much. It was a fairly guided experience. I had more of an opportunity to use SteamOS on the Steam Machine device. But on this device, it was a fairly directed demo, as I would say.
I see. So the big news here is that they're doing, they've developed a translation layer to allow x86 Windows Steam games to run on ARM. They're saying here that there's a 10 to 20% CPU cost of the CPU code being translated. But if it's a GPU bound game, it should run without that penalty, which is interesting. And so that does open the door, because I guess right now on the Quest, if you want to play standalone Quest games, you're purchasing these from the Quest store, right? There's a dedicated shop just for that. The idea here seems to be it ties into Steam VR, and if a game is compatible, you can choose to play it natively on the headset. Or I keep saying natively, even though it's like translating, but you can choose to play it on the headset itself as opposed to streaming.
Standalone. You can play it
standalone. Yes, it's standalone play is possible. So I guess there's two questions for me there. One, how was your experience with it? And two, like, what are the limitations here? Like, are they going to allow you to sort of tempt anything, like with, say, Proton? Or is there actually going to be sort of like a white list of like games that are compatible with the Steam frame?
Yeah, so before I touch on your questions, just a quick note on the tech side, because Rich sent me this a little bit ago. He thought it was interesting. On, I think, November 6th, Codeweavers, the famous company that they supply many of the technologies necessary for Proton, they announced they were doing some ARM translation. So that's potentially linked up with this. But in terms of the experience, I would say, it's not going to be capable of anything too crazy here. But I was able to play some native VR games. So Moss and Ghost Town. Moss, the game with the little mouse running around. And Ghost Town is kind of like this creepy thing where you're looking at lighthouses and things like that. But it's important to put expectations at kind of a moderate level, because it's kind of like Quest level VR experiences that you can probably run on this thing standalone. These are visually simpler games, and they're not going to run on the same level as like a dedicated PC, right? I actually spoke to one of the developers behind the scenes at the demo room, and I suggested, is this like kind of roughly Steam Deck level? And they seem to say, well, it's a moving target, but maybe that's a good way to think of it, right? So this is like a good, high-end, powerful, but still mobile SoC, right? It's not necessarily going to be lighting the world on fire. In terms of limitations on it, I actually don't think there's any limitations on it at the moment. They said it should have very good compatibility, and they will have a Steam Frame verified program for running Steam Frame games standalone on the headset. All games should work via streaming, but those Steam Frame verified games are basically certified by Valve to give you a good experience in the headset. And of course, it can play flat screen games as well, which you discussed briefly. And they showed Hades running on the device natively. Oh, obviously, you can, of course, stream these games as well. But they showed Hades running on the device natively, or at least standalone. I guess natively is the wrong term. It seemed very smooth and crisp. And it has a similar interface to when you use Steam Link on a device like the MetaQuest 3. Streaming from a PC, it's a similar kind of interface. You can resize the size of the screen with your controller movement there. You can get that kind of experience, and it is kind of neat. Now, I think it's important to put everything in context and maybe temper expectations a bit. Like, I don't think that this is as good of an experience as like a proper TV viewing experience, because the brightness of the panel is not that great. Obviously, some people get a little bit of discomfort after being in VR for a long time. I certainly get a little bit of discomfort after 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So this is maybe the thing for extended play sessions when you're at home. But if you're on the go with this device, I could definitely imagine using it portably, using it standalone, and actually having this super immersive flat screen experience when you're on the go. That's a pretty cool functionality to have on a headset like this.
I agree, and I feel like you're selling it a little short, only in the sense that this hasn't really been done before. Like, we've seen
Right.
these 2D projected images, sure, but it's always when tethered to a device,
Right.
like a computer or a game console. So being able to do this on the go, I think, is the thing that separates it. Essentially, you've got like a portable. I mean, you've got the Steam Deck, but strapped to your head on a big screen. It's kind of the promise here.
Mhm.
I think that's extremely cool and compelling, because it, like, imagine, like, taking this with you on an airplane. Now you could like play games from your Steam library on a large screen in front of you,
Mhm.
like in a place like that. That's pretty sweet. I like this idea a lot. But if I can rewind back to the native Quest level experiences, you say, so you mentioned there's the Steam frame verification,
Mhm.
but do you actually know if it's possible to just sort of force games to run and see what happens?
I imagine it will be very similar to the current situation on SteamOS, where you can choose to
Okay.
boot anything, even games that are unsupported, but that might provide a little bit of an unpleasant experience. But I'd also say that, like, for me personally, at least, in the context of VR, if you're booting a game that's not supported and you get like a low frame rate and you're getting a
Hmm.
really upsetting experience, that to me, on a flat screen game system, it's okay. But in VR, it might be very quickly uncomfortable, right? So you got to be careful with your choice of game experience potentially on this device.
Obviously, the thing rattling around in my head, and what I assumed would be possible and was not shown and seems to not be, is like running Half-Life Alyx on this thing natively. And of course, I want to try it now. People got the 2D version running on the Steam Deck, for one. It's definitely not intended to be run on there.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess the question is, like, is that possible? And if you're an old hand at VR, like jumping into a game that doesn't run well, it's no problem. You get used to it. It's
Okay.
true, if you're still not accustomed to it, it could make you feel pretty sick pretty fast. But when you're used to fiddling with this stuff, it's like whatever.
When you have your sea
So,
legs.
and I guess that's kind of the thing, is like the amount of freedom they offer is, I think, important here. The Quest has actually come a long way due to all the homebrew scene, the ability to enable developer mode. You can do a lot of cool stuff. Like, some of the best things on Quest are the Team Beef VR ports, right?
Hmm.
Like the Doom VR, Doom 3, Quake, whatever, Jedi Knight, all of those are incredible. So, so well done. So it's very important that we have freedom to kind of do what you want with the headset. And based on Valve's history, I suspect that won't be a problem. They just can't guarantee that the experience will be good. So I guess we'll see about that. So that's all cool then. So it sounds like it's not like a game changing thing, and maybe not as powerful as I had hoped, but given the size and battery considerations, I get it. It's very neat though that ARM translation layer is here. That's going to allow at least a chunk of the Steam VR library to be playable, and it should expand the overall VR landscape and also unify the shops in a way. Like, Steam VR was always kind of competing as its own thing versus the others, and if this had introduced a different store or something, which wouldn't have been very Valve-like, that would have been a disaster. But that's not the case here, so I think that's cool. But obviously, um, the streaming side seems to be very important to them as well. And I must admit, this is actually a very, very good thing. I do a lot of streaming with the Quest 3. It's very good at it already. Essentially, even with the Quest 3, I feel like when using the upper end codecs, the experience is such that it doesn't feel like you're looking at a video stream. It genuinely feels native.
Mhm.
And that's super important. And until you've experienced it, playing VR without a wire, it's game changing. It completely for me, it actually completely changes how I played VR games, especially first person, like shooting style games, because you can spin in any direction as much as you want and you essentially steer your camera and character by your actual physical position. Whereas with a cable, you have to constantly be aware of the cable position so as not to like twist it up, right?
Right.
So that's gonna, so for anybody that's like say coming from an Index or any other wired headset, this is gonna be a gigantic improvement for you.
Uh-huh.
But Oliver, you've actually tested it then.
Yeah, I
So
have.
what was this experience like? And also, have you used Quest 3 streaming?
I have used Quest 3 streaming. Actually,
Cool, cool.
I tested out Quest 3 streaming in some detail, both before and after I went to the event, just so I'd have some grounding in it. And it feels, I would say, fairly similar to that experience when
Mhm.
it's working really well. But the Steam frame, I imagine, because of its suite of technologies, should work well much more of the time, if not all the time here.
Ah, right.
So key here is that special wireless adapter, which he mentioned, and that's specifically to facilitate very low latency and very high quality PC streaming. They don't want to leave this up to chance with some routers, some
Mhm.
Wi-Fi, things like that. They have a direct Wi-Fi 6E connection between that dongle
Ah,
and the headset,
okay.
which is really cool. And it works really well, at least in my experience. Now, I did not have a ton of time stress testing this thing, but it felt very low latency. There was no stutters, nothing like that. Very high frame rate, very fluid. Felt indistinguishable from native. Out of all the VR experiences I've had, this felt completely indistinguishable from some experience that I could have had on a headset natively or running with wires, something like that. It felt very high quality. And obviously it has foveated rendering and foveated streaming, which you mentioned before, which help greatly with that, I presume, here. And there's a very easy to use VR interface, it seems, as well. And you can emulate a mouse using hand controllers, things like that. They showed me some limited
Nice.
snippets of SteamOS functionality. It was not in too much detail, but I could see there's like the SteamOS interface presented in a 2D interface that was stretched out in front of you. And if you're used to using SteamOS, you should know that this is a pretty easy interface to navigate. And it seems similar in broad strokes to a MetaQuest 3 with Steam Link, with an application like that, or like a virtual desktop kind of interface, something like that. But it felt more comfortable, more premium, and with greater ease of use. That's my impression. Because it runs SteamOS, because it has these technologies, it should just be like the most premium streaming experience that exists in the market today. That's my expectation, and that's what I think it will deliver.
That's very cool. This dongle setup, though, you're saying that's connected directly to the PC,
Yes, over
and
USB. Yeah.
and that creates an interesting potential conundrum as well. So I'm curious to see how this plays out. For instance, my PC is here on the second floor of our house. Sometimes I do wireless VR play in this room,
Mhm.
but it's not a huge room. So what I
Right.
often do is play VR downstairs in the living room, which is larger, or on the patio even. And because it runs through the Wi-Fi router, and I do have a good router for this, it actually works. Whereas I fear with the thickness of the walls in this house, if it has to be connected to the PC only, that could create problems if the headset is desired to be used in a location where your PC is not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that could be a drawback, I guess. And I'm wondering, do you know if there's any other, is that the only method for streaming through the dongle? Or is there some other, or can it still work similarly to the Quest?
I'm actually not sure about that, but they really did seem to emphasize the dongle as the way of the future on this device.
Now, one final thing on this then, and this is like synergy, man, synergy, right? You've got the Steam machine, the new Steam machine, the little cube, the GameCube.
Right.
Can you use the headset with the GameCube for streaming?
Yes, they specifically emphasized this device in combination with
Yes.
the GameCube. The Steam
There we
machine
go.
would be a good combination. It also works with the Steam interface you might have on the PC.
Any device running Steam.
Any device running Steam. Yeah, basically.
So I guess that's it. There's still a lot of things we don't know, but based on your experience, while there's definitely some potential issue points, but by and large, this does seem like it will be possibly the best headset that you could buy right now. For my money, I still, up until this point, until I test this, I can't say, but I've always said I still think the Quest 3, the original Quest 3, not the 3S, which is a downgrade noticeably. The original 3 is, I think, my favorite VR headset still currently, because it is the way you get the streaming, you get the native games, you can push the hardware up, and it has phenomenally good image quality. Um, there was also the Pico 4 headset, which I would say is pretty good, but it lacks the software support of the Quest.
Mhm.
But that also has pancake optics and was a good streaming headset as well. So there were other options, but I think that finally having a device that actually runs Valve's own software is very, very compelling. And I'm very
Mhm.
curious to try it for myself when it launches. I guess the last thing we really need to figure out, though, is how the heck much it's going to cost. Because Meta's done a very good job with the pricing. I got to say, they got the Quest 3 down to a very nice price.
Uh-huh.
Do you think they can match it, Valve, or you think they're going to go like premium here?
Well, it's a tough prospect because I'm not sure that that Facebook is making a profit off those Meta Quest devices necessarily.
Probably not.
Yeah, because they're shipping them out for pretty low prices. I think it's like $400,
Yeah.
$500 for those headsets
Yeah.
at the moment. So yeah, those are pretty cheap prices. Based on what I was told, this device, I don't think it's going to be a Quest style mass market device, but they also indicated it was not like a hyper premium price, at least the hints they would offer to me.
Okay.
Now, at the time of viewing this video on Wednesday or thereafter, our audience may already know the price. So we're sitting in the dark a
True.
little bit here. But at least as
You're
far
right.
as I know, maybe it'll sit at a midpoint between those kind of higher end devices and a device like the Quest 3. That's what I would
Quest.
presume here. I think it's reflected in the specs, the general capabilities of the device, what it can do. I think it's probably sitting fairly in that category there. But there are some deficits potentially here relative to the Quest device that are worth pointing out as well, because obviously people use their headsets for more than just VR gaming, right? VR gaming is a
Yes.
very important part of these headsets. But when you look at this device, obviously it doesn't support XR. We covered that already. It does not have high enough fidelity cameras. The cameras are optimized for low light viewing. They're
Right.
not optimized for a kind of good pass-through experience like you get on the Quest 3, or certainly like you get on a Apple
Yeah,
Vision
Apple
Pro or
Vision
something.
Pro.
Yeah, that's like
I assume that
obviously
also
intense.
means you can't do like like hand tracking, like
No.
on the Quest 3, which
They
is
did
pretty
not
fun.
show me hand tracking at all. They just showed
Okay.
me obviously the tracking
Sure,
of the
sure,
controllers. And also another key issue here, potentially for viewers, is like the Steam Machine. The Steam Machine also has this issue. There's not really good dedicated media playback, right? So the media streaming aspects of this device, they basically said,
Right.
well, you can go to a web browser. I don't think that's a satisfactory option for people to go into desktop mode and to use a web browser in this device. I think people use VR a lot heavily for 3D movie watching, for 3D video watching, going on YouTube, going on different platforms. And that would be much easier on a Quest 3 or on a Vision Pro than this device. They're going to make you go through some hoops in this device. It may not be worth it. Now, of course, people sideloading things into their headsets
Look.
and various media apps could exist that would help facilitate this, right? But out of the box, it's not going to have that functionality necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think we'll have to wait long for that. And I guess, the other selling point here is that you can use the Steam frame without a Facebook account. Sorry, I mean, Meta account or whatever.
Yeah.
So hey, that's a positive, I think, right there. But it is still an ARM device, and I assume with this translation layer and everything, we actually could be looking at a pretty interesting future here as well.
Yeah, so I actually spoke to Pierre-Luc Griffet, a Valve engineer, at the demo room, at the demo room portion of the event here. And he said that looking forward, this is potentially the first of a series of SteamOS ARM devices. And the specific quote I got was that it's the start of SteamOS for ARM, and that they were excited to bring PC content to ARM devices in the gaming world. So that really suggests to me that, like with the Steam Machine, this is the first in a salvo of devices, potentially, headsets and non-headsets, and who knows what they'll bring it to. But potentially they could bring SteamOS to other ARM-powered devices, either possibly existing devices, I don't know what the logistics would be there, but maybe new devices in different categories that might use ARM processors. Or, for instance, you could see maybe, who knows, an ARM-powered Steam Deck 2, right? Something like that. You could actually see the expansion of the SteamOS
Right.
ecosystem to not just encompass different form factors, but different hardware architectures entirely, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, they could actually leverage NVIDIA hardware here,
Absolutely,
which
yeah.
would be very promising indeed. Valve's really making some moves here, I gotta say. Very curious to see where all this goes. It's very, very cool, though. But anyway, I think that's going to do it for this video. So thanks for sharing all of your hands-on experience with us today, Oliver.
Likewise, always a pleasure, John, and always a pleasure to rely on your VR expertise in these matters.
I do love me some VR. It's good times. And we'll be bringing you some more VR when we can hopefully talk about this thing when it finally ships, which, you know, I'm looking forward to it. So
Q1 2026, they're saying.
Oh, baby, I'm there. I'm there. I'm ready. I'm ready. Bring it on. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.